Hi, my name's Natalie Brunell, and I host two shows now, a podcast called Coin Stories, where I interview the biggest names in Bitcoin, some of whom you just heard from. And I also host a new show called Hard Money, because my background is journalism, and we wanted to create essentially a news show similar to, we have in the US something like CNBC or some of these finance shows. You might have heard of them, maybe you watch them online. And really, none of these media outlets understand Bitcoin. So we wanted to provide an outlet that really understands both the big macroeconomic picture and how Bitcoin can fit in and solve some of the problems, especially in this debt spiral that we have that's impacting everyone globally. So one of the things that I'm super passionate about is using my skill set as a journalist and communicator to simplify the message of Bitcoin. So I want to do a short presentation on Bitcoin mining, because two of the most exciting aspects of Bitcoin are the Lightning Network and developments in that, but also just the base layer, the most important thing, what secures the network and makes it as bulletproof as it is, which is Bitcoin mining. And I really did not understand and appreciate Bitcoin until I understood Bitcoin mining. But it's very difficult to explain and also learn about, right? So how many people here would say that they really understand how to explain what Bitcoin mining is to maybe their friends and family in a very simple way? You understand it. Well, that's fantastic. Knut, I'm going to call on you. I think for me, at least, this was one of the most difficult parts to really understand about Bitcoin. And sometimes what I thought about is people reference Bitcoin as the internet of money. And when the internet first came out in the 90s and people had email for the first time and your @ symbol, a lot of people doubted how popular and how transformative the internet would be. But at the same time, no one really took a bunch of time to explain on the news or in videos what TCP/IP was, how computers talk to each other, and how the email or internet actually worked, right? But now you're sending value. You're putting your life savings in this. And so people want to know, how the infrastructure, how the pipes work. And so Bitcoin mining is something that I think is super, super important to understand and appreciate. So some of this will be review, but at least maybe it will spark some inspiration in terms of how to explain it to people and simplify the message for people that are not technical at all, which is really what I do and what I've done through my news job. So what is Bitcoin mining? It is 0% trust and 100% verification. Don't trust, verify. Bitcoin mining refers to the process of competing to verify blocks of transactions and add them to the ledger. And mining computers expend processing power. They use energy, which we will talk about in a little bit, to find the proof of work. And I said find for a very specific reason. So proof of work. I always thought when I heard about Bitcoin mining, it was very confusing, because the way it was described, especially by news outlets that don't fully understand it, is it's computers solving cryptographic puzzles. And I wondered, is a miner a person? People said that it was the accountants for the network, and I was completely confused by this. But in reality, it's really a system of guessing by brute force. These computers use energy to very, very, very quickly guess numbers that are too big for our brains to comprehend, and that is what the proof of work that the computers are solving is. And those numbers, or the proof of work, is difficult to solve. It's difficult to guess the number. It takes a lot of repetitive guesses, but it's easy to verify. And the hash power reflects the security of the network. So you probably heard recently that hash power is at an all-time high. That means that the network is becoming more and more secure as more computers are competing to verify transactions. And they verify transactions, and they're adjusted by something called the difficulty adjustment, which I always compared to a bicycle combination. This is the best way that I've kind of, decided to think about how the difficulty adjustment works. Because essentially when these computers are guessing, they have to try every combination. So if I gave you a combination, a bicycle lock, and you couldn't open it, how would you be able to open up the bicycle lock? You'd have to try every single number, right? So you'd start with 1111, 1112, 1113, until you guess the right number, and then the lock opens, right? So the difficulty adjustment is one in which it's the most brilliant thing that I think Satoshi invented. It's where the Bitcoin software automatically adjusts based on how much processing power, how much energy is on the network. So that ensures that the amount of time for validating each block remains very close to 10 minutes, and it reinforces Bitcoin's deflationary monetary policy and creates digital scarcity. So think of that bike combination again, right? Let's say there are a ton of computers that are competing, a ton of energy, a ton of hash powers on the network. Now imagine that bicycle lock becomes a 1 million digit number, right? It's going to take more power to guess all those numbers in order to derive at the proof of work. And once it's solved, the way that it's easy to verify is, the bike unlocks. The node gets the block subsidy. So I thought that that was a really interesting way to kind of think about it, visualize it, because that's how the network essentially functions at the base layer, validates, broadcasts to all the other nodes, and there's a general consensus where, again, no individual member has to trust another individual member, but the network provides that overall trust because it is an immutable, unbreakable system. So let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin energy, because a lot of FUD is out there right now, right? Bitcoin uses too much energy. It's boiling the oceans. It uses more than a small country. Lynn Alden is one of my favorite analysts that has really looked into the whole issue and broken it down by the facts. And this is a quote that I wanted to pull out and read today. Bitcoin's energy usage is a rounding error as far as global energy usage is concerned. And I mean that literally. When scientists estimate that the world uses a certain amount of energy in a given year, they can easily be off by a couple percentage points in either direction, let alone a couple tenths of a percent. Bitcoin is estimated to use less than 1/10 of 1% of the world's energy. And yet, what do you hear all the time in the news? Bitcoin uses too much energy. People are saying that the narrative might shift now to proof of stake because it uses less energy. Well, that truly is a fallacy. So let's take a look at some of the energy consumption facts. Because again, we have all of these computers that are competing around the world, and they're using up energy. Well, Bitcoin mining uses roughly equivalent to the energy consumption of zinc mining and refinery. It consumes less than the energy associated with the extraction of either copper or gold. It's roughly equivalent to the energy associated with running domestic tumble dryers in the US alone. So your drying machine is using that amount of energy. Consumes 1/5 the energy used for domestic refrigeration. And a large percentage is from otherwise wasted energy sources, and more than half is renewable, and we'll come back to that. So one of the greatest things about Bitcoin mining is that it really helps with energy economics, and it's location agnostic. So miners can go to where cheap energy is. So some of the aspects that they've been taking advantage of is the hydropower that was overbuilt but is underused in places like upstate New York, in southwest China before the mining ban, but people are still mining Bitcoin in China. Nigeria, parts of Africa, huge portions of Africa have a lot of hydropower that was mainly it's going unused, so Bitcoin mining is increasingly going to Africa. And then wind and solar farms, one of the most fascinating studies, the use cases, is in West Texas, where they overbuilt all of these wind and solar farms, but there's now a supply and demand issue because there's no transmission lines to actually get the energy from West Texas to the portions that are more populated that need it. It's also expensive. There's no infrastructure to do so, and it's intermittent. So sometimes there's a ton of power, sometimes there's none. So those areas actually end up having negative or zero-priced energy. Bitcoin miners come in and they basically stabilize the grid and reinforce energy economics in those areas. So they're driving incentives to produce more renewable energy farms if that's the direction that more and more countries want to go in. And then another thing that I found really fascinating is learning about flared methane gas. So a lot of oil and gas companies, for excess gas that they can't use from the oil extraction process, they actually flare it. They flare the methane. And what they are able to do now is capture it. They plug in a generator on location, and instead of flaring the methane gas, they actually use it to mine Bitcoin. And the companies actually benefit because they can offset their carbon footprint. They could get carbon credits from the government to do so. But also, they're actually literally saving the environment because methane is 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere, and that's according to the EPA. So if the government wants to be against Bitcoin, they also have to kind of explain why they would want something that potentially removes methane from the environment. Who's heard of ESG? Yeah? It's not just you, it's a really big push in the US, but all over the world as well. So ESG stands for environmental social governance, and it's essentially a set of standards for a company's behavior to screen potential investments. And the criteria considers how companies and government policies essentially protect the environment, including corporate policies addressing climate change. So carbon credits are sort of a part of this whole movement, but basically the government wants to make the rules, and it's essentially going to pick winners and losers. And a lot of people have made, their own acronyms for ESG: extreme socialism, greed, or like a couple different ones. Because in reality, this is actually very, very problematic for economics in general, as governments print money because they can't print energy. And so I always like to say that Bitcoin is actually very friendly to ESG because on the environmental side, again, more than 50% of Bitcoin mining in the US, at least, is done through renewable energy, and that's according to the Bitcoin Mining Council and the report that they conducted in 2021. On a social level, it's a peer-to-peer network offering property rights and a way to transact with no middleman, no censorship, across the entire world. Property rights to 8 billion people. That's the social side. And governance, well, luckily with Bitcoin, you have rules, but no rulers. And so what I think that we're going to enter into via ESG is sort of this new crisis, right? We had COVID, and governments love crisis. They capitalize on it. They're able to print money and stoke fear. Well, if you're paying attention to news, now it's time to offer up the climate crisis to everyone. And I just urge people to be very skeptical about it and really research Bitcoin mining, but also energy consumption and impact on the climate. We actually need, as a globe, more energy, not less. And fossil fuels are the lowest cost and most reliable. So over the past several decades, they've allowed for poverty levels to decrease around the world, and yet we still have so far to go. 3 billion people in this world don't have access to low-cost energy. They use less power than a refrigerator. That's a point that Alex Epstein has raised in his writing, Fossil Future. And the Earth has warmed 1 degree Celsius in 170 years, but during that time, because of technology, because of climate mitigation efforts, climate-related disaster deaths have fallen to all-time lows. And yet we hear from the news that this is an imminent catastrophe. The world is going to end in 10 years. In the 1970s, there are headlines from massive outlets in the United States, massive, well-trusted news organizations that said that we were about to enter an ice age and we were going to potentially freeze to death. So don't believe everything you hear in mainstream news. Be skeptical and do your homework. Renewable and solar wind, they still depend on fossil fuel plants. Most of them are made, the turbines, the solar panels, they're made in China, and China doesn't have these rules. China's going to keep using fossil fuel because, again, it's the lowest cost, most reliable. And all of this push through ESG is making energy more expensive. You probably are experiencing some of that here. In Europe, we have an energy crisis, and that has led to higher energy costs and reliability problems because a lot of these renewable energy sources are intermittent, and we've criminalized and definanced things like nuclear. So I just want people to be a little bit more skeptical because you'll be hearing a lot of climate narratives, especially surrounding Bitcoin. So some of the best resources, just to close up, Lynn Alden, again, she puts out a fantastic newsletter. She looks at things like Bitcoin's energy use, and Nick Carter's writing. He has so many links. I recently just read out loud his comments on the White House report on crypto mining, and when you read it or you listen to it, my recording of it, you just see how biased the White House is against Bitcoin and how we really need to educate politicians because they're using completely biased information and sources and misleading the public as a result. D++, I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a personality on Twitter. She's an educator in the Bitcoin space, and she does a phenomenal job explaining how Bitcoin mining works to the layperson who doesn't understand anything about coding, technology, anything. She has a great way of explaining hash functions and mining in general. So I highly recommend her. I had her on my podcast as well. Michael Saylor and Preston Pish just did an amazing episode on exactly this, the FUD surrounding mining energy. And I highly recommend the book Fossil Future by Alex Epstein because, again, yes, the climate, the Earth is getting warmer, but at the same time, we can't, in the same way that earlier panels talked about leapfrogging one financial system to another, we cannot always leapfrog from no energy, which many parts of the world still don't have, to just renewable energy and expensive solar and wind. So we really need something in between, otherwise we will